if you added one habit to your life and that positively affected your entire life? What if you intended to make one change, but in effect, you ended up making several? Is that possible? Yeah, it is. But how? Well, that's our question today. Hi everyone, and welcome again to the Eternity Changers Show. My name is Paul Allen Clifford, and I'm your host, and I'd love for you to join the conversation. So if you have any questions or comments, don't hesitate to leave them below if you're watching the video. If you're watching the audio, drop me a line on email, paul@trinitydigitalmedia.com, or head over to trinitydigitalmedia.com/contact. You can always hit me up on Twitter. Any of those ways of contacting me are totally okay with me. This is the show where every week I talk about what it takes to go out and change lives and eternities, to follow your calling and be who you always dreamed of being and who you were always made to be. So today, let's talk about a concept that I've just recently heard about, and it's called Keystone Habits. Now, I've actually discussed this a little bit earlier when I was talking about how nothing succeeds like success. But this is a little different, so let's flesh it out a bit. While it's the case that when you succeed at one thing, you start to believe that maybe, just maybe, you can succeed at other things, it's also the case that there are certain habits that are more powerful in this way. So, let me talk real quick about what a keystone habit is. A keystone habit is a habit which, once established, it affects other habits in various ways. Usually it's something that affects your self-identity, and so therefore it causes you to act in different ways. So let me give you a perfect example. All my life I've been thin. Now sometimes I've been what they call skinny fat, where I wasn't big, but I wasn't muscular or toned either. I was soft in the middle. Not big, just soft. So with that in mind, I always thought of myself as not athletic. I'm a thinker. I'm not an athlete. I wish I would be an athlete, but I'm just not. So that's the way I thought. Well, fast forward to April, which is 4 months after I turned 39. I decided, hey, I've always wanted to start running. Why don't I try that? Worst thing that can happen, I'll hurt myself. I'll go back to the couch. No big deal. I was on the couch anyway, and I don't need to be super mobile in what I do. So, worst case scenario, I have a little pain and it probably gets better. Worst case scenario. So that's how I started my running career. I started with Couch to 5K, and my initial goal was to, every time the lady said on the app, you can start running, I would run immediately. And then every time she finished her sentence saying you can walk, I would wait until she finished the sentence, not actually stop early. So that was my initial goal. And I hit it. And before long, I started finding myself doing different things. I would go out and run on days where normally I wouldn't have. I started waking up thinking, oh, I get to run today. I started picking out different clothing. I started to shop in a different way. You see, being someone who exercises, you start to think of yourself as an athlete on some level. And you start to do certain things that you assume athletes do. And they tend to be positive things. So, this is an example of a keystone habit. This is something that I changed, exercise, and that affected how I ate, how I dressed, how I acted, my confidence, and a lot of things. So, I want to suggest to you that you just need to find these keystone habits, and a few little habits will start to affect your entire life. Being an entrepreneur is like that. You start thinking, well, if I can start a business, clearly what someone who owns a business does is they don't sit on the couch. They don't wait for opportunities, they make opportunities. And I think that that's part of how you become a success is you start to think that you shouldn't be doing your default, you should do other things, and you start to do them. Now, you won't be perfect at this. You won't immediately come out of the gate and be great at it. But as you're doing this, you'll find that more and more you kind of do the things that you assume that you should do, as opposed to the things that you think, I wish I was someone who did those. So let's talk about things that can affect a keystone habit. Ways to identify it. That's probably a better way to say it. So I was thinking that a keystone habit is one which will affect how you see yourself. I never saw myself as an athlete, but now I do. I never saw myself as a runner. Now I do. And I never saw myself as a weightlifter, but now I do. So once I started running, that affected these other habits. So if you always wanted to be a writer and you start writing, you might start thinking, if I'm a writer, maybe I ought to write more regularly. If I'm a writer, maybe I ought to try and get published. If I'm a writer, maybe I ought to try and sell some of this stuff. See how that works? So it should affect your self-identity. Flossing maybe isn't like this, right? If you start flossing, which is a good habit, you may not necessarily think of yourself, well, a flosser eats more vegetables. See, they don't affect. But if you say, well, someone who is healthy probably flosses their teeth, see how that's the opposite. You start with what affects who you are, and a habit which, once that affects who you are, will cause other positive habits. Next, once established, are there other small habits that you'll want to add onto it? So once I started running, I started thinking, maybe I ought to eat a little more healthy. Maybe I ought to lift weights. Maybe I ought to sleep more. Maybe I ought to fill in the blank. So if it's the case that you add one of these keystone habits to your life and there are other small habits that you think, oh, well, that goes with it, of course. Now that I've done the big thing of exercising, of course it would be the case that I would eat better. That's just a small thing. But if you started with eating better, maybe that wouldn't necessarily lead to exercising. You see how that works? So a keystone habit is a larger habit that will attract, almost magnetically, other smaller habits, and the net effect is larger than perhaps you originally thought with the keystone habit. Next, Will it cause me to avoid certain things because I'll think someone who blank, whatever the habit is, does or doesn't blank, whatever the thing is that you should do positively to avoid the negative, or whatever you shouldn't do. So, someone who runs doesn't smoke. Someone who writes doesn't watch as much TV, etc. So, those are just some ideas of how you can identify these habits. And remember, a habit can take 20 days to form, it can take 6 months to form, but once it's formed, it becomes easier to do. It's not as hard as going over the hump of the initial try for it. It's more like, oh, well, I suppose I can do that. And before you know it, you actually can. So, if you like this show, don't forget to subscribe, share, like, comment, etc. Remember, the best way that you can help the show is to share this with someone else. Another great way is heading over to Patreon, patreon.com/PaulAlanCliff, patreon.com/Paul, PAULALAN, Alan, Cliff, CLIF. And you can support the show there as well. I hope that helps you. And I hope that it helps you in your quest to go out and change eternity. Until next time, this is Paul Allen Clifford with TrinityDigitalMedia.com.